The wind moved like a whisper across the plains, rustling through the brittle grass with the sound of memory. Long shadows stretched across the earth as the sun sank behind the hills, casting a hush over the little town of Clover Pass. The dirt streets glowed amber. Horses shuffled behind rails. And at the edge of the town cemetery, a man stood still beside a small wooden cross. Elijah Ward didn't cry anymore. The tears had long since turned inward, buried like seeds in drought-hardened soil. He stood with his hat pressed to his chest, the brim held to his heart like a vow unspoken. The name carved into the wood was nearly worn smooth, Anna Ward, though the townsfolk still remembered her laugh, which had once rung louder than any bell in the chapel. Elijah hadn't spoken much since she passed 2 winters ago, not in full sentences anyway. When the land took her in childbirth, something in him had collapsed, so quietly even the birds hadn't noticed. He ran cattle now and fixed fences. He did what needed doing, and no more. His neighbors respected him for his silence, though they feared it too. There was a weight to it, like thunder that never quite broke. When he came into town on Fridays for flour or nails, folks offered soft nods. He'd answer with a slight tip of his hat, never lingering. But he always stopped by the grave on his way out, not out of duty, but because it felt like the last honest thing in the world. That Friday, the wind was warmer than usual for spring. Elijah's boots stirred the dust in slow, steady steps as he led his mule cart down Main Street. The train would be coming in soon. He paid little mind to it, never waited for passengers, never expected change. But life has its own rhythm, and sometimes it beats louder just when you've stopped listening. He was tying off the mule near Bessie's general store when he noticed the station growing quieter than it should have. The train had come, hissed, and gone, but something in the air had stayed, a kind of stillness, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Then he saw her. She stood alone at the edge of the platform, her suitcase at her feet, her wedding dress dulled by soot and time. It was a kind of white that once dreamed of promise, now frayed at the hem and heavy with miles. Her veil was crumpled under one arm. She didn't cry, didn't move, just waited, as though refusing to admit the waiting had ended. Children stared. A man chuckled awkwardly. One woman muttered "poor thing" and turned away. No one stepped forward. No one asked her name. Elijah didn't move either, not at first. He simply watched. Watched the way her shoulders squared themselves against the whispers. Watched the stillness in her hands, how they didn't fidget like someone lost. She didn't look helpless. She looked like someone who had held onto hope until it bled. He made his way to the store, but the image stayed in his chest like smoke. It was after he bought his nails and flour, when he passed the station again, that his feet paused without asking. She was still there. Same spot. Same silence. The sky was going orange now, the shadows growing longer. He walked over slowly, each step more uncertain than the last. He didn't know what he would say. He only knew the look in her eyes. It mirrored his own from the winter he buried Anna, when the world had continued turning without permission. "Thirsty?" he asked, quiet as wind. She blinked, like his voice had pulled her from underwater. She didn't nod, but she didn't say no either. He offered her a small canteen from his side. She took it with hands that trembled just once. Drank, then handed it back, eyes never lifting from the horizon. "Someone coming for you?" he asked after a beat. Still, she said nothing. Her grip on the suitcase handle tightened. "Didn't think so," he murmured. He looked around. The platform was empty now, the town moving on like it always did. He didn't ask her story. He didn't need to. A dress like that didn't get dirty on purpose. Suitcases didn't end up at your feet unless something or someone had been dropped. Instead, he sat on the bench beside her. Not close enough to touch, just near enough to say, "I'm here if you want me to be." The air between them settled. A sparrow landed on the rail and chirped twice before flying away. She spoke, barely audible. His name was Thomas. Elijah said nothing. He said he'd meet me at the station here. Start over. Said we'd have a house and a garden. He told me he liked yellow flowers. Her voice cracked, not from sorrow, but dryness. as if she'd repeated the story too many times already, to herself, in her head, on the train that never ended. Elijah nodded once. "You like yellow flowers?" She looked at him for the first time. Her eyes were gray, not the kind of gray that reminded you of clouds, but of stones at the bottom of deep water. "No," she said. They sat a while longer. When she stood, suitcase in hand, he asked, "You got somewhere to stay?" The pause was answer enough. The boarding house down by the mills got a kind keeper. "Miss Devlin. She don't ask too many questions." The woman gave the barest nod. "You tell her Elijah sent you," he said. "She'll feed you first." She turned, dress catching the evening light like lace made of ghosts. "Clara," she said, almost to herself. "Clara Dane." He tipped his hat. "Elijah Ward." She gave him one more look, not grateful, not expectant. Just a look that said, "I saw you too." He watched her walk away, not into a new beginning, but into a town that might not know what to do with her. Back at the mule cart, he glanced at the station once more. The silence was different now, less like absence, more like the breath just before something is spoken. And somewhere in his chest, beneath the sorrow and dust, something shifted. He didn't know her story, not yet. And she didn't know his. But the sun had set behind the hills. The stars were beginning to show. And in the place where grief had lived for so long, there was now a quiet flicker. Not hope. Not yet. But the space it would need to grow. Clara Dane took to silence like a shawl around her shoulders, worn, soft, and used to being misunderstood. At the boarding house, she kept her room tidy and her words minimal. Miss Devlin didn't press her. That was the thing about old women who'd seen enough. They recognized when a soul needed space more than questions. Each morning Clara swept the porch before anyone else stirred. Her wedding dress now hemmed to the knees, with thread the color of quiet resignation. She washed dishes without being asked, brought in firewood when the cold returned, even mended a boy's torn cuff after he tripped near the bakery. The townsfolk began to see her more as a figure in the background than a curiosity, though the whispers still rose like smoke in the spaces behind church pews and over morning tea. "She must have done something," they said. "No man leaves a girl like that without reason. She carries that suitcase like it's full of secrets." But Clara didn't flinch. She had already survived the leaving. Words couldn't scrape what had already been hollowed. It was 2 weeks after the train when she crossed paths with Elijah again. He was on his way back from the blacksmith, his shirt dusted with earth and his hat tipped low against the spring sun. She was walking with a small parcel from the seamstress, mending thread and 2 buttons nestled in brown paper. They paused, as though remembering they had already shared something wordless. "How's the porch treating you?" Elijah asked. His voice was steady, roughened with years and something gentler underneath. "It doesn't creak anymore," she replied. "I fixed the boards." He gave a short nod, impressed but unsurprised. They stood there like 2 trees that had weathered the same storm. Words weren't needed. It was enough that they hadn't turned away. Elijah began offering quiet gestures after that, never asking, only leaving space. He'd leave an apple on the bench where she sat in the evenings. She once found a book there too, a collection of poems, pages soft with use. On its inside cover was a name written in delicate, feminine script. A. Ward. She traced it with her thumb, but did not open it until the 4th night. When she did, she read slowly, whispering the words like a prayer for someone else's soul. The poem spoke of light through windows and the warmth of home, of grief wrapped in beauty, of wild flowers blooming where nothing ought to grow. She closed it gently and held it to her chest. She did not cry. In return, Clara began bringing carrots for Elijah's horse. Not every day, just enough that he'd notice. The first time, she left it in the trough without a word. The second time, she waited. "Daisy likes her quiet company," he said, watching the mare chew. "She don't take to many folk." "Neither do I," Clara replied. He chuckled, a sound like boots brushing sand. Not loud, but honest. They began to walk together in the evenings, not by arrangement, but by habit. Down by the edge of town, where the creek curved like a question mark in the earth, they'd stroll beside each other. Sometimes she'd speak of small things, how the wind always came from the east, how bees liked her hair, how Miss Devlin once danced with a judge in a lightning storm. Other times, they'd walk in silence, their footsteps in rhythm, without trying. But the town, like most towns, didn't appreciate what it didn't understand. It began with a woman crossing the street to avoid them. Then a shopkeeper who paused too long before serving Clara. Then, one Sunday, the pastor's wife took Elijah aside. "She's not for you," she said in the tone of someone who thought herself merciful. Trouble follows women like that. Elijah didn't answer her. He simply turned and found Clara on the chapel steps, watching a wasp hover near the eaves. She met his eyes, and he gave her the smallest shake of his head. The next morning, Clara found a bouquet of yellow wildflowers on her windowsill. She almost didn't pick them up, but then she saw the note beneath, written in Elijah's careful hand. "You said you didn't like yellow. Thought I'd ask again." She smiled, the first true smile since the train. That evening, under the wide sky, she finally told him part of her story. "We were supposed to go to California. He said we'd build something." Her voice was low, filled with spaces between the words. "But I think he only loved the idea of me, not the woman I became." Elijah didn't ask for details. He simply let the silence widen and hold the weight with her. "Did he say why?" he asked softly. "He said I was too much. That he wanted someone gentler, someone less scarred." Elijah picked up a stone and turned it in his palm. "Scars mean you've lived," he said. "Anyone can love something perfect, but it takes something truer to love what survived." Clara looked at him, then really looked. In the angle of his jaw, the slope of his shoulder, the way his hand trembled slightly before stilling, she saw not just kindness, but quiet courage. Not the kind that gallops in, the kind that stays. "You speak like someone who's lost more than you let on." "I loved a woman who died giving life to a boy that didn't make it," he said, matter of fact. "Buried them both in the same winter." Clara closed her eyes, not to retreat, but to receive the truth of it. "That kind of loss," she whispered, "stays in your bones. Some days I feel it more than my breath." Their hands remained at their sides, but the space between them had changed. The next morning, Miss Devlin poured Clara's tea and said nothing, but her hand lingered for a second longer on Clara's shoulder. The town still watched her, but now they also watched Elijah, and they thought twice before speaking unkind. When the storm came, as all storms do, it rolled in without warning, gusting wind, hard rain, the kind that turned roads into rivers. Miss Devlin's roof began to leak. A beam cracked. Panic stirred. Elijah arrived before the sheriff, helped reinforce the beams, carried Miss Devlin to the back room, calmed the children. Clara stood near him the whole time, not needing protection, but refusing to leave. After it passed, when the porch was dry again, and the stars came back, Clara and Elijah sat on the top step, mud on their boots, breath shared in the hush of aftermath. "You stayed," he said. "You didn't ask me to. You didn't have to." She looked out toward the hills, where lightning still flickered in the far-off sky. "Neither did you," she said. He turned to her, eyes steady. "Maybe we both needed a storm," he said, "to see what wouldn't blow away." Clara reached over, took his hand. It was a small gesture, almost nothing, but in it, two broken hearts remembered what it meant to be held without being fixed. And somewhere beyond the trees, a train whistle cried again. But this time, no one needed to leave. The morning came wrapped in mist, curling low over the plains like breath from an unseen mouth. Clara stood in the field behind the boarding house, boots damp with dew, a length of linen apron folded over her arm. She watched the sun try to burn through the haze, and thought of Elijah. Thought of how silence with him didn't press, but stretched, like a hammock between two trees, built for resting, not escape. He had not asked her to stay. He hadn't tried to charm, persuade, or rescue. He had simply made room. And sometimes that was the loudest kind of love. She found a note tucked in the side of her door that morning. Not in an envelope, just a strip of rough paper folded neat. "Rain's coming. Ride with me to the canyon. E." She ran her fingers over the handwriting. It looked like a man trying to write small, careful letters with big, calloused hands. By midday, they were riding side by side through the prairie, their horses crunching over dry grass. The sky was a soft iron gray, wind stirring in the distance like a thought not yet formed. Clara's hair had been braided for the ride, but a few strands had already escaped, lashing against her cheek. They didn't speak for some time, and that was fine. The rhythm of hooves, the occasional call of a hawk overhead, were enough. The canyon rose in the distance, its copper walls folding the earth like a secret letter. They stopped where the trail narrowed and dismounted near a crooked tree leaning over the ledge. Elijah led her to a smooth flat stone. It was heart-shaped, almost too perfectly so, worn down by wind and rain over years too long to count. "Anna used to sit here," he said, settling beside it on his haunches. Said the stone felt warm even in the cold. Clara knelt, brushing her hand over it. It was warm, sun-baked and gentle, like an old palm pressed to her back. "I bring flowers here sometimes," he added. "Not to grieve, just to remember." She nodded slowly. "Do you think it ever stops hurting?" "No," he said. "But it changes, becomes part of the way you see the world." They sat without speaking for a while. Below them, the wind danced across the canyon floor, stirring dust and wildflowers alike. Then Elijah spoke again, voice low. "If you don't want to go back to California, or wherever he promised, you can stay. With me." Clara didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the distant rock face where shadows were gathering. "That a proposal?" she asked. "No," he said. "Not yet. Just a place. A life. If you want one." A bird called overhead, high and wild. She didn't answer then. Didn't need to. Her silence was no longer resistance, but consideration. Later that evening, alone in her room, Clara opened the small wooden box where she kept keepsakes she didn't admit to keeping. A cracked button, a pressed flower, the train schedule tucked beneath them, still folded, still yellowed at the edges. She unfolded it, traced the route with her fingertip. Departure, arrival, return. It was still possible, still available. But the idea of leaving now felt more like a fear than a freedom. She pictured Elijah waiting by that heart-shaped stone. And for the first time, the future didn't look like a burden. It looked like breath. She walked out in the dark and lit the paper in Miss Devlin's stove. Watched it curl, blacken, and vanish. The next day, Clara brought a loaf of bread to Elijah's porch. It was clumsy and over-browned, but smelled of time and effort. She left it on the step with a note tucked beneath. "I'm not whole, but maybe we could learn to be half-broken together." There was no signature. He'd know. When she returned later that day, she found the empty bread tin and a single wildflower placed inside. Spring crept into the land, slow and shy. The earth softened. Shoots of green peeked through the dirt. In town, people began nodding to Clara again, still guarded, but less brittle. Miss Devlin started humming while cooking, and even the pastor's wife once left a basket of preserves on the porch without a word. Clara moved to a cabin Elijah had built years ago for hands he never hired. It was small but strong. The floor creaked in the corners, and the window panes trembled in the wind, but it felt real in a way no mansion ever could. They began to fall into something unspoken, not quite husband and wife, but something older than those words. He'd leave his boots by the door. She'd mend the hole in his sleeve. He carved her a spoon. She warmed his tea before he asked. Nights were often spent reading. The book of poems passed between them like a lantern. Elijah didn't talk much about Anna, but Clara felt her there. In the garden Elijah planted again, this time with yellow flowers. In the locket that stayed on his nightstand, untouched but never hidden. Clara didn't compete with her ghost. She welcomed her. There was room for both grief and beginning. One afternoon, a child wandered onto the property, a boy with bare feet and scraped knees. He stared at Clara like she was magic and asked if she was the lady from the train. She knelt to meet his gaze. "I was," she said, "but I got off." The boy nodded solemnly. "That's good. Trains are for going, but sometimes people belong where they stop." She gave him a biscuit and sent him home with a story about a horse that could smell storms. But there were still moments. Sometimes Clara would wake in the middle of the night, her chest tight with memory. The sound of the train whistle would claw into her dreams. Or she'd see a man in town with the same stride as Thomas and feel her spine lock in old fear. On one of those nights, she sat on the porch wrapped in a shawl, staring at the moon like it owed her an answer. Elijah stepped out barefoot and sat beside her. "He ever hit you?" he asked, after a long silence. "No," she said. "But it's strange how someone can make you feel small just by looking through you." He nodded. "Some folks love the idea of you, but not the cost of knowing you." "I was too loud," she whispered. "Too passionate, too full of opinions, too alive," he said. She looked at him, and he met her gaze fully. "You were too alive for a man who wanted a mirror," he said. "I don't want a mirror." In that moment, something passed between them again. Not electricity, not longing, but steadiness. That rare and quiet thing that grows only when two people have nothing left to prove. The next day, Clara braided her hair with yellow ribbons and brought out her mother's old dress, not white, but a soft shade of cream like the edge of morning light. Elijah wore a clean shirt. They walked to the river where the water hummed over stones, and Miss Audrey, the seamstress, stood waiting with a bundle of lilac in her arms. There was no crowd, no chapel, no preacher, just two people and the wind and the scent of spring returning. Vows were not exchanged like ritual, but spoken like promises meant to be kept even in the quiet. "I will see you," Elijah said, "even when it's hard." "I will stay," Clara replied, "even when I'm afraid." They sealed it with a touch of hands and a smile so shy it could have been mistaken for sunlight. And just beyond the trees, the earth continued blooming. They were not whole, but they had begun. The afternoon sun rolled across the town of Clover Pass like golden molasses, thick and slow, catching on windows and glinting off horseshoes. Clara stood at the market with her basket half full, examining a small jar of honey. Life had settled into her hands now, routine, humble joys. She knew the price of eggs without asking. She knew Elijah's preferred tea. And each morning she awoke not with fear, but with rhythm. But peace, like prairie wind, is never still for long. She sensed him before she saw him. Some animals carry their storms inside, and the ones they've hurt can always smell the thunder coming. The horse was too clean, its rider too confident. The town paused as he rode in, like a held breath. Clara turned slowly, and there he was, Thomas. His boots too polished for travel, his smile honed like a blade, and his eyes scanning for her with the certainty of someone used to being found. He dismounted and walked straight through the street like he still belonged to it. "Clara," he said, as if his voice could unwrite all that had followed. She stared, expression unreadable, the way a river stares back at the sky. I came to make it right," he said quickly, "to fix what I broke." The market buzzed around them, but she heard only the quiet hiss of memory, the train whistle, the absence, her own breath catching in a veil she never wore again. He looked at her dress, plain and dusted with flour, his mouth pulled into a grin meant to charm. "You still look beautiful," he added. A part of her, small and once desperate, had dreamed of this. Not because she wanted him back, but because she had once wanted an apology. But he wasn't offering that. He was offering a rewrite. A version of their story where she'd waited frozen and perfect, and he'd simply forgotten the ending. "I didn't know what I had," he said, stepping closer. "I was scared. But I've thought of you every day. You and me, we can still." She held up a hand. Not trembling. Steady. "I'm married now." That stopped him, though he tried not to let it show. "To who?" She didn't answer, just turned her gaze toward the ridge where the canyon met sky. "I just need to talk," he tried again. "Just for a minute. Please." She hesitated, not because of doubt, but because ghosts deserve a grave. They walked beyond the edge of town, down toward the old post trail. No one followed. She kept her pace firm, eyes forward. "I panicked," he began. "You were so full of fire, Clara. So much want. So much voice. I didn't know how to carry that." She stopped walking. "I wasn't meant to be carried," she said. "I was meant to be met." He looked at her, then really looked, and the absence of what once tethered her to him made the air, between them colder than shade. "I made a mistake," he said softly. "No," she replied, voice like glass worn smooth. "You made a choice. And I made a life." With that, she turned back, leaving him among the shrubs and dust, where lost things belong. Elijah was at the well when she returned, shirt damp from hauling water, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He saw her walking, faster than usual, her brow furrowed like a storm front. She didn't speak until she reached him. Then, without a breath, she said, "He came back." Elijah didn't flinch. He set down the bucket and waited, not for explanation, but for what she needed. "I don't want to see him again." "You don't have to," he said. Her shoulders softened. She stepped closer. "I just needed to look him in the eye and know that I no longer wanted what he took." Elijah wiped his hands on a cloth. "And do you?" She shook her head. "I want what we have, even if it's not perfect, even if some of it still aches." He nodded. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he touched her face, the roughness of his palm anchoring her. Later that night, the sky split open. Rain came sudden and hard, hurling itself against the roof, rattling windows and sweeping through the cracks like a tide reclaiming shore. Elijah was already climbing the ladder when Clara came out, sleeves rolled and braids swinging behind her. "What are you doing?" she shouted through the wind. "Patching the corner before it floods the pantry." "I'm coming up." "You don't need to." "I'm not standing below and watching you fall." So she climbed, dress whipping, hair sticking to her cheeks, boots slipping once before finding purchase. Side by side, they hammered and nailed and pressed boards over the leak. Rain pelted them, soaked them through, until they looked like river spirits battling the sky. At one point, he slipped. She caught his arm. He steadied, their faces inches apart. "You stubborn woman," he said, breathless. "You stubborn man," she answered. And then she kissed him, not like a fairy tale, but like a decision, a tether tied tight. When the storm passed and the stars blinked through again, they sat on the roof, legs dangling, soaked and shivering. "I don't think love is about saving each other," she said. "No," he murmured. "It's about staying when it storms." They climbed down slowly, hands intertwined, as if the climb had sealed something wordless between them. Weeks passed. The land greened. A calf was born, wobbling on knobby legs and bleeding at every sound. Elijah named it Clover because it was born in the middle of everything, and Clara laughed, though she insisted it was ridiculous. She started reading to children by the riverbank. Word spread. Soon, mothers began sending little ones to sit in a circle while she spun stories. Elijah would sometimes watch from afar, leaning against a tree, arms folded, smiling at the way her hands moved as she spoke. "You were always meant for this," he told her one evening, after the last child wandered home. "For stories?" she asked. "For staying." On the night of their 1-year vow, they sat by the fire, the same place where silence had once stretched between them. Now it wrapped around them like a familiar coat. He handed her a small box, plain wood, carved with care. Inside it was the cracked button from her keepsake box, polished, set into a silver chain. She looked at him, eyes misting. "I found it in the drawer one day," he said. "Figured something broken can still be worn close." She leaned into his shoulder, the fire casting their shadows across the wall. "You ever think we'd make it to here?" she asked. "No," he said honestly. "But I hoped." Outside, the wind moved gently, tugging the curtains like a curious child. He took her hand. "Clara Dane Ward," he said, voice low and steady. "You were left at a train station wearing a promise no one meant to keep. And I was a man who'd stopped asking for more from life than silence. But you sat beside me anyway." She turned to him fully now, her hand rising to his cheek. "And you saw me," she said, "not as ruined, as real." He kissed her again, slow and sure. And in that moment, all the dust of their past grief, betrayal, abandonment, loneliness settled behind them. Because love, the kind that stays, isn't made of grand declarations. It's made of daily choices, muddy boots, held hands, patchwork roofs, and quiet nights by a fire that never asks to be more than warm. And if someone ever asked Clara what she learned on the day she was left, she'd say, Sometimes the wrong door closing is just the wind making space for the right one to open. Because when the train pulled away, it wasn't the end. It was just where her real story began.